Well, hello and welcome back to the third of four virtual events in our annual TPI Winter Spectrum Series. Today, we will be discussing preparing for WRC 27. Joining us today are Austin Bonner, Umair Javed, David Ruddle, and I'm Sarah Olam. So let's start with a review of the timeline. As of today, we're about 20 months to go before the WRC 27 meeting in Shanghai in October of 2027. On February 19, about 5 days ago, the FCC hosted an open WAC meeting, which is a WARC Advisory Committee meeting. The NTIA shared their recommendations on February 18 in a letter. And yesterday, February 23rd, there was a printout of the consensus and non-consensus agenda items from the WAC published to the record. The FCC is collecting comments before March 6th. And CTEL meetings are coming up in April and December of this year. So I think the US needs to have positions before then or aiming to do so. Before we dive into topics such as Agenda Item 1.7, which I think should be a good discussion, let's start at a high level and talk about what it means for the US to be ready for the meetings. From each of your experiences, you've been in prior work delegation preparations. What do you see happening now, and what do you think needs to happen in this time period right now? Is the US getting ready properly? And do you have opinions about needing a head of delegation before the 6-month mark in April, or is it pretty much not needed yet? So I guess just take your turns.
Sarah, you're going to have to pick who goes first because none of us are going to volunteer.
Okay, do you want to go first, David?
I should have kept my mouth shut. Of course I will. Yeah, so look, there's a lot packed into that as to what we need to do at this point. I think the most important thing, yes, we've now gone through the dog and pony show of the WAC, which presents one side of one agency in the process. And I think the problem we've had in the last couple of cycles that I hope we are able to get past in this cycle is that everyone in the domestic process wants to get 110% of their given positions agreed to by the United States. And if we can't get 110% of our positions, we're going to blow the whole process up. We're going to drag it out. We're going to drag the White House in. We're going to make it a whole thing. And it's been a detriment to the way the United States takes positions forward because in reality, the best way to assure you're going to have a seat at the table on the last day, which is when any of this matters external to the US delegation, is to take positions early, whether they are positions that everybody loves or positions that are contentious. And as we're going into the CTEL process, I think everybody involved is going to have to remember that, yes, of course, domestically, you push for the position you think is the best position. We all have the things we want to get out of this process, and you should absolutely advocate for it. But not getting everything you want shouldn't be a reason to blow the whole process up. And it's going to be on the administration to not let industries blow the process up when they don't get 100% of what they want. And so, going into CTEL, we need to have a seat at every table because when it comes time to resolve the square brackets, close the conflicts, figure out how it's going to happen, it doesn't happen on microphone. What happens is everybody who has a proposal, who has a contribution to the PCC is going to go and get told, go off in a room by yourselves and come to a conclusion and come back and report out. And if you don't have a contribution, you literally do not have a seat at the table to have that conversation. So I am hopeful that we can establish positions for the United States and that everyone understands those positions are not red lines. They're not lines in the sand. They're not the thing that we are going to fall on our sword over when we get to the end stage of the game. I used to tell people all the time when they'd ask, what is this really like? I said, it's kind of like legislating. If you show up at the legislative hearing with a bill in which you have decided I can make no compromises at all, your bill is never going to become law. So be prepared to have an adult conversation about what's best on an entire slate of proposals and not just what's best for my particular outcome in this particular issue. And I'll light myself on fire if it is not the end of it. And now I'll get off my soapbox and Umair and Austin can tell me why I'm wrong.
Well, I think David identifies a really important issue for this stage in the preparation that's going to last for the next 18 months, which is you really have to know your priorities as a member of the delegation going in and understand that when it comes down to that like last sets of trading and closing brackets and trying to get things done, not everything that we care about is of equal weight. And having those things well worked out amongst the government about how we're going to prioritize and how to, I mean, to effectively stack rank some of those priorities and know what you can trade and what you can't trade is a long term process that can't be done in the middle of the night in a hotel in China.
And yet it will be done in the middle of the night in a hotel in China. I think David and Austin have picked up on exactly the right things and something that's very, very true. A challenge that has existed not just for this upcoming World Radio Communication Conference, but for many, many previous World Radio Communication Conferences, which is that it's really hard to get domestic consensus in advance of the conference, and it's only getting harder. And it's going to be true this time around as well. And this is where early leadership, I think, is very important. And if I could add one nuance to what David said, which I agree with, which is, industry should not be blowing up this process if they don't get everything they want. It's that that's true for federal agencies as well, who are just as likely to try to blow up processes when they feel like they're not getting everything that they want. And so this is going to be important for everybody to consider. I think on that theme of where do we have early leadership already as we're thinking about the timeline for the World Radio Communication Conference, there is one thing that I think is worth noting up front, which is a little bit unique this time around, which is that, really, I think for the first time that I can think of at least, is that the president has issued a direct public instruction to federal agencies this time around to support early U.S. positions on spectrum for 5G and beyond at the World Radio Communication Conference. Right in December of last year, the president issued a memorandum on winning the race to 6G. It says it's the policy of the U.S. to lead the world in 6G development. It recognizes that certain steps are necessary to achieve that goal. And perhaps most importantly for our discussion, it requires then a whole of government support and diplomatic engagement to advance U.S. positions on Agenda Item 1.7 specifically, which we know is exploring 5G use of the 4 and 7 gigahertz band. So I think it's interesting that we have presidential direction on a specific agenda item this early in advance of the conference. That's not something I've seen before. It's the only instance I know of a specific agenda item being called out by the president. And I think that the US delegation has to give that meaning as we now think about preparation. Sarah, you also mentioned, what are we doing? And then also what do we need to be doing? And if there's one thing that I would hit on where I think we do need more work, and I'm going to jump right to the elephant in the room, which is that this conference we know is going to be hosted by China in Shanghai, and that adds a unique layer of complexity to it. And as we think about how we need to prepare for this specific conference, I think one thing we should be doing more of is really prioritizing undertaking a detailed assessment of China's interest in tactics, right? Really understanding it and preparing to counter it. I don't think we can just prepare in a vacuum or guess what we might be up against. And right now, I think we have a very preliminary understanding of how China might use this conference to sort of reshape the global norms and rules in its own image. I think we have a very superficial understanding of their spectrum priorities, of their satellite strategies, and much, much more. And here's where the government, I think, can be very helpful, right? It's got a lot of tools at its disposal to do this sort of thing, whether it's Congress asking CRS or GAO to produce a report on exactly that question. What are China's interests and tactics for this conference? We could think about what we do with that information, right? Do we work on some sort of information sharing platform with our allies that focuses on tracking exactly this question and then working with them to counter those activities, especially the ones that threaten to erode sort of the rules-based order that we expect at the ITU. And I think leading structured discussions with Japan, Australia, our allies in Europe, as well as the traditional fence sitters like India and Indonesia, well in advance of the conference around that question as well. I think all of that would ensure that we have not just a technically rigorous approach, but also a diplomatically rigorous approach as we think about preparation for the conference.
I can
Umair,
chat. If I can, go ahead,
you go
Austin.
ahead. Well, I think you've raised an important point, Umair, about understanding our host country very well. One of the things that I feel like I really learned from the 2023 cycle was how much influence the host country can have on, if not the substance of the final decisions, the process by which decisions actually get made. So many of us who do this work got our start in the FCC world and were rigorously trained in the Administrative Procedure Act and in notice and comment and high degrees of transparency that our government requires. WRC is not a democracy and doesn't apply those rules. And so I think you have a very strong idea for thinking about how we're like well prepared for some of those issues. There's some logistical problems too that I think we'll talk about later.
And I would add on top of that, I think, just to put a little point, well, I'll disagree a little bit with what Umair said and then agree with him because I feel like that's par for the course for us, Umair, when we do these panels. I'm not sure that the United States has as concrete a position coming out of that presidential memorandum. I mean, we have a piece of legislation that's signed by the president that says one thing and a presidential memorandum that might point a little bit different, and now WAC guidance that arguably says do internationally what is literally illegal domestically. So I think we have a little bit of challenge on 1.7 still ahead of us. That said, I think one of the things we have fallen into the trap of, and I mean by us, I mean the United States writ large, is thinking that the WRC is about agenda item 1.7 and not about the entire agenda. And so I think to Umair's point, right, we need to understand the satellite positions as well, because at bottom, the WRC has the biggest influence on the sector of satellites. And so as we are looking at what our adversaries are thinking about doing, how are we positioning ourselves to make smart trades in the end game that benefit US satellite interests and US domestic terrestrial interests in ways that come together harmoniously? Last time we had this happen, I think it's pretty well established now that it came down to who gets screwed, satellite or terrestrial. And because the US didn't have a real good strategy, the answer was both. And so I think we need to have a little better strategy session going in, have gamed out a little more of the process. And to Umair's point, we've got a lot of allies that we need to sit down with in bilaterals and have real adult conversations about how are you going to vote on these things and what roles can we play vis-a-vis each other.
That's a good segue to like what are the stakes for this year's or WARC 27? So satellite and IMT designations. Do you have a sense? I mean, we can kind of surmise right now, if you were China, how would you want to position? And it would be based on private, like their own planning, but it seems transparent enough that we're in a race for space and for capacity, like mobile bandwidth. Would their goals be similar as the US? Like how would they find advantage by being a host country?
So I'll jump in because as I usually do. Look, I think one thing we need to remember when we're looking at China's priorities is that the way the Chinese operate in both of those fields, satellite and terrestrial wireless, has very little bearing on how the United States does. They're not in a demand economy. They're in a command economy. When the Central Committee tells them you're going to build a network density of this, you're going to put up this many satellites, it's not a commercially derived answer. It's not an economically derived answer. It's an outcome-driven answer for which economics are irrelevant. And we need to remember that as we look at the way we do things in the United States and the way they do things in China, that because they're coming from a completely different set of motivations, their outcomes don't necessarily reflect the same inputs as we do in our process. And I think as long as we remember that our industries are very different, despite the fact that they are using the same technologies, they have different desires, they have different outcomes that they're looking for, we can do a better job of understanding why they've taken certain positions and how or why we should oppose them.
I think you'll agree, David, that there's a good case study in their approach to the 6 gigahertz band. They don't make the same kind of equipment. We're talking about in Wi-Fi unlicensed and American-led technology. They don't have the same motivations to harmonize that throughout the world, and if anything, have some motivations to try to stop our success in that band.
So, I agree with what everyone has said, but I don't think it's necessarily that simple either. I think as you think about ITU agenda items, it's important to remember that these are not system specific, right? These are broadly applicable regulatory frameworks that apply everywhere in the country. And so it's not the case that the US can go advance a position or a proposal that would only benefit SpaceX, for example. We know China's as interested in an NGSO economy as the United States is, and positions that would benefit our NGSO ecosystem will equally benefit China's NGSO ecosystem. And if you look at the agenda items at the World Radio Communication Conference, you see that bear out. China is not opposing those positions. They recognize they will benefit equally from them. And that's something that we have to keep in mind. Where is China opposing the United States? It is actively opposing us in the identification of additional terrestrial spectrum for IoT systems. And the reason for that is, as Austin has mentioned, they have identified a path in the 6 gigahertz band. They're not very much motivated to ensure that there's not a US alternative to that in the 7 gigahertz or the 4 gigahertz band. That's where you see very aggressive opposition from China. And it's not about those spectrum bands. If you look at the studies, the fundamental studies of 6 and 7 should be the same. You look at the studies that China put in on 6 gigahertz, change the number to 7, and they have studies that have the complete opposite result, right? That's not an accident. This is about foreclosing US competition and US alternatives. And I think we have to be mindful of that as we think about how do we have these conversations at the ITU.
I couldn't agree more that China's positions are about foreclosing American competition, but we disagree on why. They're trying to foreclose American competition because IMT is a technology that they love. They're faster at building it, and it's centrally controlled. Turns out if you can drive packets through a core where the central party can view them, that's a great outcome for a system where you don't have a whole lot of communications freedom. And so I think what we're seeing is they want to continue to maintain their dominance and their advantageous listening position globally based on their use of Belt and Road and Huawei. So I think we agree on that front, Umair, that they do want to foreclose equipment being put out from America and its allies in this space, but not because they're worried about competition, but because they're interested in maintaining the existing dominant position they have in IMT and expanding their ability to listen to people's communications globally.
David, I think that's the same thing, right? They want to maintain their dominance by foreclosing alternatives and new competition from the United States. And I think,
Umair, that would be true if we had any people in the United States making global equipment for those bands, which we don't. The Swedes do, the Finns do, the Koreans do, but we don't.
The competition isn't necessarily just the US, it's US-led. And US-led technology stacks have always included our allies and partners. And that is what they fear, right? That is what they want to foreclose. And I think if you just substitute the technology, just replace 5G with AI, I think, David, you would reach the complete opposite conclusion, right? Very similar dynamic where China is developing artificial intelligence technologies. They are aggressively seeking to export it into other sectors and other economies. That technology will reflect their values. They want to foreclose alternatives and competition from the United States. But I don't think anyone would say that the answer to that is that the United States should not develop artificial intelligence, otherwise they're helping China. I don't think anyone would say, well, the United States should go do something else. I think the answer would be compete. We've got to develop the alternative. We've got to push
back. If you guys were building anything in the United States that was US led, it'd be a little bit different. But you're not. It's the Swedes, the Finns, and the South Koreans that are building these technology stacks.
So David,
they're allied countries, and we love them. But calling it American-led is kind of facetious. Let's just be honest about that.
There is an increasing Open RAN economy in the United States, and again, the point is an trusted alternative ecosystem.
Umair, how many of your members have deployed Open RAN? How many of your members have deployed Open RAN?
All the major nationwide carriers.
Baloney, and you know it.
AT&T and Ericsson. The point, David, is again, having a trusted ecosystem that's an alternative to Huawei. Now, your answer of just don't have one and let everyone go to Huawei, I don't think is the right solution. Your answer that 6 gigahertz unlicensed Wi-Fi is a competitor to that is completely facetious, right? That's not the same thing. And no other country in the world would suggest that that's an alternative. Those are complementary technologies, absolutely. The rest of the world has taken a very nuanced position to this, which is we need to lead in both. Right, they've made opportunities available for both unlicensed and mobile, and that seems like a very sophisticated way to approach that problem. But to say that that's the alternative, I think does not work at all.
Okay, speaking of the rest of the world, we have proceeded 20 minutes into the discussion as if there are only two countries. We are in an active process right now of preparing for CETO, for preparing for our region. There is important diplomacy going on there and developing regional positions. And it's not just government diplomacy. It is, individual American companies working to work with their customers, work with governments where they serve lots and lots of people to try to create regional harmonization. These are important markets. It's important for interference management, interoperability. So while I think earlier I endorsed Umair's focus on trying to figure out the motivations of our host country, I do think it's worth remembering we've got like 6 billion other customers to think about.
193 nations, right? There's 193 votes at the ITU. So
Absolutely.
So going back to thinking about like the process at WRC 27, and Austin, you mentioned it's not a democracy. I was learning about just the way things work there. It is closer to a legislative process, but it's not a vote. But treaty making, each country gets one vote, but it's not an actual like numbered vote that's public. From your all's experiences, how does coalition building work at that level? Like all these relationships and alliance building coalitions have to happen before you get to the meeting.
They absolutely have to happen before you get to the meeting. That's why people across the government and across industry are sort of engaged in these bilateral and regional discussions right now. It is, I think, worth considering that some of what's going on in those discussions is trying to predict a little bit about the future, right? Everyone is thinking about how we're going to be, where's AI demand going to be in 18 months? How are we going to meet it? What changes does it require to our communication systems? And if you actually know what the answers to those questions will be in 18 months, I would like you to please tell me how to set up my stock portfolio. I Dialogue is really important, and it's, I think, been really heartening to see. One of our challenges as a country is that there's pretty much, even if the administration has stayed the same, new actual political leaders every time we go into one of these conferences. And while this is an important part of their job, and I'm really heartened to see a lot of folks in this administration talking about it early, it is one of their like 40 jobs. And so in that process of preparing in collaboration with career staff, we're also all helping those people get ready to play the role that they've got to play. And that includes getting to know some of our important allies really, really well.
And I think one of the things that maybe we have undersold, and I don't mean just this panel, I mean, I think the United States writ large has undersold, is that we will learn a lot about what WRC's horse trading situation is going to be like. And Sarah, to answer your actual question, look, anybody who's ever participated in the legislative process knows this feels more like trying to get something to pass on the floor by voice. You got to figure out how to get everybody just unhappy enough to keep their mouth shut. And that's essentially what you do in a consensus process at the ITU. You figure out what's the absolute minimum I have to give to my adversary to get them to go along with the slate. And that's where we're at. And I think we're going to learn a little bit about everyone's motivations because we have another meeting before then. We have Plenty Pot, and we're running a candidate at Plenty Pot. So we're going to be, as a country, actively engaged in the kind of diplomacy you have to be engaged in to get your candidate a victory. And right now, Doreen is running unopposed, but that is not a guarantee by the time we get to Plenty Pot. And so I've been heartened to see that, they've demarched the posts. We've got the commercial folks and the state folks who are in post across the world talking about Doreen's candidacy and trying to figure out where the motivations of the different regions are and how this will play out. But we have a little bit of a, it's not where everyone's going to show their hand completely, but you might get one or two cards that get played that make you think, wait a minute.
Yeah.
They're definitely not where I thought they were. And that'll be a very telling moment for all of us.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And Austin hit on something earlier in this conversation, which is, how can the host country exert some influence in this process? And here's a great example of where they can do that, right? There's really no definition of consensus at the ITU. And the ability to sort of step in and say where there is or isn't, that's a place where the host country can exert more influence than other members that are present for that discussion. And so that's something to consider. I think the trend line that Austin picked up on is exactly right, which is that there's this kind of growing prominence of the regional bodies. It really does feel like the most important proposals are often shaped at the regional level long before they're submitted to the conference. And oftentimes, what that means is you go into the conference with these proposals already enjoying a whole lot of support from the get-go. And because of that, they've got a lot of momentum from day one. And it just demonstrates how important it is to get that regional consensus. So I would just note here that there is a upcoming CTEL meeting here in Dominica. It's going to be a key opportunity for the United States for that reason. After that conference, there will only be 2 more opportunities for the US to bring new proposals to the region for Work 27. And so we've got to make the most of this opportunity that we have.
And I'll double down on that. And I think it's of the 3 regions, our region is the one in which regional consensus is the strongest indicator of success. CTEL, we fight like siblings within CTEL. Like the countries of CTEL do not necessarily see eye to eye, but when we do, and we get an inter-American proposal together, it's a hard-fought victory, and there's usually a lot of arm linking that goes on once you've gotten to an IAP. So I agree everything you said, Umair. This is absolutely going to be very telling what happens in the next couple of CTEL meetings.
One thing I'm keeping an eye on that I think is important as we develop this is that these negotiations with other countries don't happen in a vacuum. It is not as if our only relationship with them is about a particular agenda item. I think a lot of our past diplomacy has been seen in the context of our diplomacy about Huawei and ZTE, or our diplomacy about Open RAN, for example. This administration has a very big context window for what goes into any particular diplomatic negotiation. And I think it's worth us just keeping an eye on our important partners and allies, that these are not one-shot deals. We're engaged in lots of things. It's one of the reasons why states' role is so important in this process.
So I'm going to jump ahead because I saw someone ask the question, since Austin just asked about head of Dell, and somebody had asked whether or not the last delegation had challenges because Ambassador Lang had not yet been confirmed. I think, look, we could post-mortem the last WRC till the cows come home and not agree on the 65 different things that went into how things turned out. From my perspective, instead of looking back at the last one and saying what went wrong, I think it's more helpful for us to look at previous WRCs and figure out what things contributed to success. I think one of the things that has to happen is you have to have a head of delegation that understands intimately both the administration in which they're working and the industries that they're representing. And if you don't have the kind of subject matter expertise to both navigate capital and navigate industry, it's a really difficult position to be in. And I am very hopeful that that's what we'll see come out of both the Plenty Pot and the WRC delegation, is a head of Dell who is steeped in the work that we do, understands the players, and frankly understands how to tell people to stop being children and be adults, which is a big portion of delegation management, being able to look at people and tell them, I understand you want all the candy, but eat your vegetables.
Is there anyone who's actually against the head of Dell being a longer term job? It's incredibly important and incredibly hard job, with lots of talented people at state helping you. But I don't think I've ever heard anyone say, no, it's really great that we make that person start 6 months in advance.
That seems like an easy fix. I completely agree. And I think David raises a great point here about the importance of the head of Dell and what skills they need. And frankly, I think in this discussion, there's always been 2 schools of thought, and I don't think these are mutually exclusive, but just for the benefit of the conversation, I think there's always been this question, is the head of Dell, is it better to have someone who knows the industries and the technical issues and can navigate them with sophistication, or is it better to have someone more from the diplomatic side who might not be as familiar with our industry, but knows how to operate in the UN system and operate with other countries? I don't think there's a perfect answer to that. I think there's pluses and minuses to both, but I think that's a conversation that's been happening in the background as well.
Now, Austin, I will say, I will disagree with you a little bit. Do I think that the head of Dell should be a long-term career job? No, I don't. I think you have to have people that are coming in that have had some recent downtown experience. I think
I
that
don't,
is a key part of it. So,
yeah.
like, is it a 5-year job? Maybe. Is it a career park it for 20 years job? I don't think so. That's what the state career staff are for. They bring that to the table for the head of Dell. So I think you've got to have somebody who's more recently been downtown, or in the case of some of our friends at state, ever been downtown, than simply having somebody who is long term in the job.
I'd settle for a full cycle. Um,
Fair.
I, I do think it is also just important to remember the WRC is a team sport. And that you can take a Moneyball approach to some of these questions and try to build all of these different skills out of a few different people. The NTIA administrator plays an important role. The chair of the FCC plays an important role. Um, the White House often plays an important role. And sort of trying to make sure you've gathered all of the things that you need across those people can be very effective.
Right. So I guess logistically, yeah, like in the comments, there is a confirmation cycle. So there would need to be a statutory change, I think, to have it be longer than a 6-month appointment. Are there ways to prepare or kind of pick somebody before that 6 month? I mean, is there anything to say that, you know, the US can't have someone in mind 2 years before the
All
meeting?
right, so we'll make this a little bit CLE, right? We'll do this for everybody. Look, there's two
Are
kinds
you
of
still a
ambassadors.
lawyer,
I am. How dare you, Austin? I am. Just because I don't do CLEs anymore doesn't mean my license isn't still active. Come
David?
on.
Continue.
So look, there's two kinds of ambassadors, right? There's an ambassador extraordinary and plenipotentiary. These are the ambassadors that are confirmed by the Senate and have lifetime appointments. And there are special ambassadors, and that's ambassadors to a particular meeting. And that's what we use for these ITU meetings in general. We use the special ambassadorship, and those are time limited. And essentially, it's like a 9-month post. So it's 6 months before, and they leave the 3 months after the event to have the time to wrap up and write the reports and do all the things. Yes, in the past, have we seen people that were put in the post a little bit early? Grace Coe is a great example. Grace was essentially moved from the White House over to state as a Schedule C. She spent time over there working, 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 doing the things you need to do. And then when it came time that she could be made the special ambassador, she was made the special ambassador and went and represented the country. So there are certainly methods to have people in place to do so. It does present a bit of a challenge because you have to find someone who is willing to forego whatever their real job is to take a temporary posting that's like a year and a half to 2 years long. Obviously, if you're already in the executive branch, as Grace was, that's a real easy yes. Hey, would you like to go be an ambassador? Of course, the answer is yes. I think it's more challenging when you're looking for someone who is downtown, who maybe has to figure out how to deal with conflicts and who has to deal with other issues to ride them out. And frankly, let's just be blunt, take a US government salary to do the job.
And as much as we're focusing on the head of delegation, which obviously is a very, very important position, I think it's worth focusing on the rest of the resource needs that we need. And I want to flag one thing here that actually my colleague Mike Mullinex has zeroed in on quite well. And I've worked with Mike at the FCC and now here at CTIA, and I honestly believe he's one of the most well-rounded ITU experts in the country. But what he's hit on is that we also need more government staff to support U.S. participation at Work 27, both at the conference and throughout the preparatory phase, right? It's not enough for us to just go and develop U.S. positions. Ultimately, we need people who can speak for the United States at the conference, people who know how to advocate successfully in that environment and under the ITU rules for the positions that the United States has adopted. And I think there's a continuing need for that. As we think about that, industry can be a resource, right? The government has often slid in industry to be spokespersons where it makes sense to do so. And there's years of experience in the private sector to help support the US delegation on that. And so we should leverage all the resources available to us. But as we think about head to Dell, I think we also need to think about all the layers below that.
Umair's point is, I think, a good flag to Becky's question in the chat that I think it's incredibly important for industry members to engage in the Dell and to really prioritize trying to be on the ground when you can. I personally, during the time that I was in Dubai, got a lot of value out of having industry there in person, people ready to talk, particularly technical experts. The rest of the world doesn't bring lawyers to this fight. They bring engineers. And there are pluses and minuses of that approach. But the role of industry on the ground, it makes an enormous difference. It's a strength that we have. And it's something that I realize is a big sacrifice for a lot of people. It's a lot of work, but it matters.
I'm going to tie both of those things together and say, look, I think there's two changes to the way we run our delegation that would make things much better. One, there has been a more recent policy that U.S. government contractors cannot act as leaders in conference settings. I think that has been to our detriment. These are largely people who spend all day, every day, essentially working as a U.S. government employee. They're carrying CAT cards, they're carrying PIV cards if they are in an executive branch agency. And they're basically told you have all the downsides, but when we need you to actually step up, we can't let you. I think that has been to our detriment. And I think the other thing that's to our detriment is for some reason the United States won't let registered lobbyists participate in the delegation, which I think is silly. At best, it keeps people who negotiate these types of things for a living on the sidelines. And at worst, it encourages people to play cute with registration. And I think solving for both those problems would give us the ability to have a bigger, more effective delegation on the ground. Because one of the strategies of our adversary is to flood the zone, bring as many people as they can, and spread the defense. How many subgroups, ad hoc working groups, how many on the margins conversations can we make important and spread the decision makers or spread the skilled staff from the United States in a way that means there are opportunities because they don't have somebody in the room who can say, no, we're not putting square brackets around that. And it sounds silly, but that really is a strategy that has been used against the United States quite effectively in the last couple of WRC cycles.
Maybe someone in the chat will remember the number, but I feel like someone calculated that Huawei as a company was like the third largest delegation in Dubai in 23.
Yeah, it was. There was China, United States, Huawei as a sector member. Yeah.
Are there limits on the numbers of people that can go? Or, I mean, is there anything holding back aside from what you said, like okay, so
cost. That's what's holding it back is cost.
It's so expensive.
It's so expensive. It's cost. I mean, you've got to be willing to go live somewhere essentially for 3 weeks.
And do you think it was a rational move for Huawei to spend that much money? I mean, is it beneficial for industries to be that represented there? If so, then why not spend the money?
I'm going to come back to what I said at the beginning, which is that you can't compare US companies spending US dollars to Chinese companies spending yuan. They're in a fictional economy, so their money doesn't mean the same thing.
I mean, but that kind of is, in the middle, though. I mean, if outcomes matter to the US and that's the rules of the game in China, should the US be spending US corporate dollars?
I think the US, and look, Umair, I see you about to jump in, so I apologize, but I think in general, every part of the US apparatus should be more engaged. US government, US agencies, the Congress, who only occasionally shows up, but I think would be a great idea to have more involved. Like there are people there that want to be more involved, and industry. And, the challenge is, like I said, it's very expensive. And let's be honest, it's a slow burn. It's a long, slow burn. If you're going to really participate and know what you're doing, you're in the working party process, you're in the regionals, you're in the conference preparatory meeting, you're engaging over the entire 3-year cycle. And that's a not insignificant time and money investment for a company.
I would just add, Sarah, to your question, about how effective has Huawei or China been in these settings. We understand their tactics pretty well, and we've talked about it. I think to the question of how effective has it been, I think it's been a little bit of a mixed result. They've certainly been able to get language into IT resolutions that sort of match their view of the world. And they've had other successes where they've been able to take their tech champions and align with ITU and work efforts, including their Belt and Road Initiative. So a mixed record there. I think the United States generally sends a very large delegation to these meetings. It's not that the US is not investing. David and Austin might actually remember this better than I do, but I think in recent conferences, actually, there's been a trend to try to reduce the size of the US delegation. And, consistent with the discussion that we've been having, I'm not sure that's something that I think deserves another look, right? What are the right resources that we should be sending to this conference?
I mean, in a way, you could say that's like a benefit of industrial policy for them. They have, the government behind them and collective act pooling of funds. And our system is, competitive, commercial, market driven outcomes. But for something as acute as a treaty, it's a short term conference. It could be instrumental to have agreement from U.S. companies to send delegations, larger delegations. I don't.
This is where it comes back to sort of doing that work of understanding their tactics and their interests, right? If you look at, the ITU at the end of the day is a one country, one vote system. And if you look at how China has been successful in that conference, it's because they generally align closer to the group of 77 members, right? These are the global South countries, and they've always acted to maximize their negotiating capacity at the UN, right? They've always done that as a bloc. And the difficulty, right, is how China is able to leverage those historical relationships with the developing world and the influence over those kind of regional voting blocs. And then supplementing that, as David had mentioned, with their willingness to provide economic investment through the Belt and Road Initiative and other mechanisms. And so this is why I come back to, we really need to have a more detailed assessment of their tactics and their interests in order to effectively counter them when we get to the conference.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, Umair, that, let's just also be honest about what's happening. Not every country has the same ethical constraints we do.
100%.
Buying and selling votes at plenipotentiaries happens. It does. Countries are for sale on the voting front, and they're not shy about it in some respects. When we saw Doreen's first campaign for ITUD, I mean, there were some countries that were very clear, like, it'd be great if you could X, Y, or Z for our country. And as a country, of course, we do not buy votes. That's not what we do in the United States. And so, look, I'm not suggesting that we should change our tactics. I'm saying we should acknowledge that taking the high road makes our job more difficult. And it means we need to leverage the other tools that we have much more effectively in order to overcome the deficit that we have vis-a-vis our competitors.
Great. Well, looking at the agenda items, we've kind of danced around agenda item 1.7, which we'll be watching the docket and seeing like what comes in before March 6th. I'm sure there'll be economic studies and just a rigorous debate about the particular band, the federal band. But there's also lunar activity on the docket. Or on the agenda items for WARC. How about competition for moon activities? Do you see that being, if you think long term, is that a major like trading point? Like, doesn't the US have an incentive to get moon access?
I think you have, Sarah, hit on an area where none of us are experts. We're all journeymen or apprentices at best on cislunar activity. And I think, look, I think the important thing to think about when you're looking at the lunar question is that it is another piece of the trading environment in the entire suite of agenda items. And if we're taking this sort of to a level of abstraction where how do you look at this, there's sort of three ways that you deal with particular agenda items, right? You either want to get it done, in which case you are willing to cut deals. And that has a temporal component to it. It also has a what's it going to cost me component to it. And then on the other side of the ledger, it's like, well, if this is something that either I don't want to happen or is going to be more challenging to get in the current environment, you look at how do you buy yourself more time. And again, this is not unlike legislating, right? If you're not going to get to yes, then how do you figure out how to get yourself more time to negotiate? And I think for as we look at the suite of issues that are on the agenda, I think, frankly, the one that's probably going to get the most, other than 1.7, which always gets a lot of interest, I think the one that is probably the most urgent because it got kicked down the road last WRC is the EPFD issue and dealing with emissions for satellites and how to deal with the proliferation of low Earth orbit and make sure that they are not disadvantaged vis-a-vis GEOs. And I think that is an issue that last time got a lot of talk, and at 11 hours and 59 minutes, it got kicked down the road. And I think those that are advocating for EPFD reform are like, okay, we paid our 3 years worth of dues, it's time. And how will that impact
Mhm.
the other agenda items if that becomes a priority? And I think it should be a priority for us, right? Obviously, we have a fight globally for who's going to lead in Leo. And the United States right
Mhm.
now enjoys a pretty great position with one system in orbit and one being put up. Um, how do we maintain that advantage going forward? I think that's going to be an item that is under discussed, but will likely be a much bigger part of the agenda than I think anyone is really acknowledging right now.
And I think we just, on that issue, we have to go in eyes wide open, right? We have to understand the environment we're walking into. And the reality is that the US is an outlier in our region on those satellite issues. For many of the countries in our region, their access depends on government-funded GSO issues. And so our interest in NGSO opportunities
Mhm.
is going to have trickle-down effects that David is talking about. It means that some countries initially are going to be reticent to want to be in a partnership with the US, knowing that that's a core priority for us, right? So we just, we have to be eyes wide open to sort of what's happening in the rest of our region if we're going to be successful in not just the specific conversation, but the overall diplomatic approach.
I completely agree. And right, that's sort of what happens in this is the question becomes the trade-off.
Yeah.
Is it better to lead on NGSO or get consensus on other issues? And last time it was let's get consensus on other issues. I think this time it's probably going to be we're going to want to lead in NGSO or excuse me in Leo, and I think we're going to see
Mhm.
that play out. I think there's been a pretty consistent drumbeat from this administration of trying to promote U.S. Leo dominance, U.S. Leo leadership, and I would be very surprised if that doesn't become a significant portion of our going forward agenda.
I
Um,
think it's maybe worth noting, we've talked a lot about, I think, some important priorities for US industry. The government is having the same conversation internally. We're going into this conference while a land war is in progress in Europe. NATO is in a different place than it has been in the past. There are those discussions have to run on the same rails at the same times, and we should just anticipate that sometimes those discussions have unexpected interactions with each other, and have interactions with things like we're an exporter of military systems. Like we've sold people things and told them how they worked for decades. And we should expect those conversations to keep kind of coming back into the mostly commercial discussion that we've been having here today.
yeah, not to talk too much about space since it's not our expertise, but there is a lot of activity for the EU Space Act in Europe, opposition from US companies, satellite companies to overregulation by Europe. So there's going to be overlap with general space topics because so much of WARC 27 is satellite based. Do you find that, you know, you yourselves are learning more about space issues or that we need to in order to to do spectrum policy?
I think a couple things on that. One, I think we actually are fluent in orbital space issues. I will say the thing that we are, I think, and I'm speaking for my fellow panelists, but I think we're all pretty conversant in orbital space issues. It's the lunar issues that I think are more emergent than have been in the
Mhm.
past. But to your point, Sarah, I feel like we could play Mad Libs with your sentence and it would still be true. Hey, look, the Europeans passed blank because they're concerned about American leadership in blank. Oh no, what's it going to mean for competition between the two regions? This is nothing new for Europe and the United States, right? And you look, Umair's sitting at the center of that, right? Like wireless competition has been a place where the leadership pendulum has swung many times. And I don't think it's something new. The US wants to lead in everything. I think space is another place where we can, and historically we have been. You know, historically, the United States has been one of, if not the global leader in space-based exploration, space-based observation, space-based
Mhm.
communications, you name it, we've been there. And so I don't anticipate that this round will be any different. Our European colleagues are going to do what they're going to do. They have a very different approach to competition and leadership than we do. And we'll see how it shakes out. I am I'm bullish on the American position. I'm bullish on our ability to out innovate and out compete our global competitors, but we'll see how it plays out.
One of the messages that I'm hearing from this administration is a back to basics approach for the ITU and really focusing on the heartland of the radio regulations and what's sort of core to this treaty. And that's not to say many of the lunar issues are in that heartland, but it's a consistent theme that sometimes other parts of the world try to bring issues into the ITU or into WRC. And my sense is that there are lots of folks in this administration who want to resist that for resource reasons. Like the ITU has plenty to do with respect to WRC. We don't need to expand the scope dramatically. But I think it's worth watching as you think about some of these European laws, sort of like what's really the WRC's job here.
I'm laughing because it reminds me of my favorite response to when those new issues come to this conference, which is that sounds like a good issue for the development sector of the ITU. Just try to push it anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
I think the one thing we haven't mentioned, and I did see it in the Q&A, so thank you for whoever brought this up. I don't have it open on my screen at the moment, but the piece we haven't talked about is that, as is the case, we are running a candidate for the Radio Regulation Board. And that plays into the way we trade for things. Jennifer Warren is the U.S. candidate for the RRB. The U.S. has had a seat on the RRB and I'm not going to pretend I know the stat, but it's been a very long time. It's an important position for us to have an American in that seat. And that is absolutely going to be one of the chits that we have to figure out how to trade for when we get there. So putting aside for a second the fact that we have 1,000 different policy positions that we have to square the circle on, we also have to figure out how to do the things we want to do and maintain that seat on the RRB. So that is a wrinkle we haven't talked about, but it's one that is a significant part of what the U.S. diplomacy is going to be.
Speaking of questions, I wonder, since there's some questions in the chat, maybe we should talk about Sarah's questions on the logistics of doing this in Shanghai.
Yeah, do you have thoughts or recommendations, or what are preparations that need to happen? And then also, I mean, can your members go to Shanghai? Can government employees or officers go? I know I went to Hong Kong and China recently, and even my iPhone in Hong Kong, it turned on its own when I landed, even though I turned it off. And then I used a different phone when I was in China on the mainland, but you know, they're going to be in an environment that is definitely closed network. So how are they going to operate?
I know the government is working hard on this question because diminishing our presence is not an option. We have to make it work to be there and be active. And we have to make it work to be able to work together in person on the ground and with people back in DC. One of the concerns that I have that I know people are thinking about is, we talked earlier about how all of the leaders in this process have a million other important things they're working on, including OBBA deadlines and the ongoing work of their departments and agencies, as well as folks trying to just keep, their business responsibilities going back home. I guess I have joked about this lots of times that my husband moved out of our bedroom for the final week of the conference in 2023 because he was tired of listening to me talk to Steve Lang on the phone in the middle of the night. Those conversations are really important, and we have to find a way to be able to have them. And we have to find a way for people like leaders at NTIA to keep doing their day job, which is one of the hard things about this conference.
I mean, the other thing just to bear in mind, look, we've all been, all three of the panelists, we've all been U.S. government employees. And so we know that when you are a U.S. government employee and you travel abroad, even to friendly countries, you are issued a new wireless device, you are issued a new laptop and told essentially we don't even trust our friends. So take these and you can never plug them in anywhere in the US. When you get back, we'll put you back on your old equipment. Look, that's going to have to get turned up to 11 for everybody going to China. You should just assume you are under constant surveillance because you likely are, no matter whether you're a commercial participant or a government participant. And the host country agreement, to Austin's point, the US government is going to do everything it can to provide some sense of security for the folks who are there. But if we're being honest, the home field advantage on being able to take advantage of that. That is something that is you can ameliorate, but you can't eliminate.
Yeah, the information security challenge I think is going to be very real. Sarah, to your point, there will be companies who look at this and say we cannot go, and some have probably already reached that decision. Even for the companies who decide they will go and they will participate, there will be a conversation about what level of person can you send. Are you going to send a senior executive or decision maker, or do you feel unsafe doing that? And remember, this is not a week-long conference. This is a month-long conference. That's a long time to put someone in a situation where it's difficult to communicate back with the home base. So as much as Austin was saying that those conversations are very important for the USG, it's important for all of the participants as well, and it's going to be a challenge this time around.
Great. Well, we have time for one final question, and I think just curious about CTEL. So CTEL is regional, and that's where I guess a lot of activity happens as well, coming to a position for the region. Do you all foresee certain battles happening at the CTEL meetings? And that's sooner.
This meeting is hard. The host country, Dominica, it's challenging to get to. It's going to be an expensive trip. I think we've heard that for some countries it's just too much, and that participation is hard for them. That's not unusual, right? As we've said a million times, this is an expensive process to participate in. But our work there and our work both out inside, working toward the CTEL meeting in April, but also just being in ongoing dialogue with our regional partners remains very important. And if in-person participation in Dominica is limited, then that makes those ongoing discussions even more important as we work toward 27.
And on our issues, on the issues that the wireless industry is really prioritizing, I'm feeling like there's a good start in our region. Mexico was a key player in getting 7 gigahertz added to the work agenda. And so I imagine that they'll continue to champion that discussion inside our region. It looks like, I think Brazil, also will be supportive of that. So I think there's going to be a continued strong focus on IMT issues in the region. I think a place for the United States to make progress.
I think it's also a good way for us to sort of gauge the way it's going to be played on the global stage. China has significant influence with some of the countries in CTEL, in particular Mexico and Brazil. And so it will be interesting to see what arguments they employ in CTEL as potentially a bellwether for how things will play out in the larger process.
Great. Well, on that note, thank you so much for your expertise and your background on the work process, providing a little bit more transparency to it, and hope to invite you again to another panel.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.
Bye, everyone.